With the next federal election likely more than a year away, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is attempting to position himself to Canadians as the next Prime Minister, as the party maintains a sizable lead in the polls over the governing Liberals. Now, a new book is detailing Poilievre's life and political career, looking back at the almost 2 decades Poilievre has spent as a member of Parliament before being named Conservative leader in 2022. Andrew Lawton is the author of Pierre Poilievre, A Political Life, and he joins me now. Andrew, I have to say right off the top, I'm sure there's some loyal CBC people watching this saying, why is he having that right-wing guy from the True North Centre on? And some of your viewers and readers are going to say, why is he talking to Cochrane at the CBC? But I want to thank you for taking the time today to come out and talk about your book.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, look, the book starts with a discussion of Pierre Poilievre's early years in Calgary, how his interest in politics started early, and really just kind of brings us up to the present day. You've had a fair amount of access to Pierre Poilievre over the years, so we didn't talk to you for the book. I'm wondering what stood out for you. What did you learn? What was the big surprise you had in researching and writing this book?
One of the interesting things to me was the consistency he's exhibited on a lot of the issues that motivate him over the years. Obviously, there have been little things where he's changed. I mean, same-sex marriage, that's one where he famously voted against it and it has now called it a tremendous success in Canada. And term limits, of course, that's the one that everyone likes to poke fun at when he once wrote about how MPs should be capped at 2 terms. But for the most part, when he talks about free market capitalism, freedom as the tide that raises all boats, these are things that he was writing about when he was a political science or an international relations student at 19, 20 years old in Calgary, and they're still central to his political brand and messaging today.
You call him a movement conservative, right? You say he doesn't fit into the blue Tory, red Tory, social conservative sort of boxes that people tend to put people in. What do you mean by a movement conservative specifically as it applies to Pierre Poilievre?
I think he's evolved as the conservative movement in Canada has, and he's really gone along with where the base has been at any given moment. And I think that tracks right back to his early involvement as an adolescent in Preston Manning's Reform Party, getting involved in the fight to bring Stockwell Day in as the Alliance leader, and then the fight to merge the Alliance and PC parties to form the Conservative Party of Canada. But even in the last, however many years, the last nearly 2 decades that he's been a member of Parliament with the Conservative Party of Canada, you can see him evolve as that party has. And I think the moment that he became a leadership candidate, really in the throes of the pandemic, you had the Freedom Convoy, this tumult in the Conservative Party, he really showed that he was really tracking where the Conservative movement was and the base was. And I think that's made him a very unique figure, and not just in conservative politics, but in Canadian politics.
I wonder how you think he might have evolved since his time as a minister, in particular, in the Harper government. Because, Andrew, you're a conservative guy, writes for a conservative outlet, so a lot of people might think you go easy on Pierre Poilievre in your book, but there's some segments there where you're quite critical of him. Like on page 100, when you quote a conservative as saying that he was insufferable when he was a minister. And you note that when he switched portfolios, a lot of his staff didn't go with him except for his driver and I think his parliamentary aide. What should readers take from that assessment, and what does it say about how he might function should he become Prime Minister, as the poll suggests he has a really good shot of doing?
And just on that note, I should point out it was difficult to get a lot of the people that had worked with him in that period to speak. A lot of the ministerial staffers he had when he was in Democratic institutions, I tried to reach out to and just couldn't get anyone to reply for the most part. And I did get a few people that had worked for him and with him. And there's a split on this. I mean, some people, like that individual you just quoted, felt that he was just a really unpleasant, overbearing, demanding person. And other people took a different spin on that, which is that that's what you need to be effective in this role. So I was certainly getting a little bit of the spin when I was interviewing people for that. I think that there's no doubt that he has gone through his own maturation process. I mean, there were some of the earlier missteps, whether it was his comments on residential schools, whether it was that episode with the RCMP and the security gate on Parliament Hill. He's had these moments, and he has, for the most part, apologized and moved on from these things. I think when you talk about his track record as as a minister and his time in that Harper government, it was clear that he was really moving up the ladder from the moment that he took his seat. I mean, he was a scrappy critic in that first term when the Conservatives were in opposition, got a parliamentary secretary gig, clawed his way into cabinet. And I mean, clearly it's worked for him because now he's the leader.
That residential school comment, you describe how Stephen Harper dressed him down quite substantially in the Prime Minister's office, where he essentially said he didn't know if Canadians were getting value for money, for the money they were paying as part of the apology and other investments they were making in Indigenous communities. There was another issue you write about when he was a cabinet minister, and this was right before the 2015 election when he was announcing the increase in the universal childcare benefit, and he wore a bright blue Conservative logoed polo shirt, which is a no-no, as you flat out say, when you're a cabinet minister making a government announcement. You highlight how this shows how he was focused on always connecting policy with politics, and that even if he broke some rules, people would understand the increase in the check came from the Conservative government of Canada. But he ended up with a compliance agreement with Elections Canada out of that. The sort of thing, if a Liberal did that today, I think he'd be writing the RCMP and calling for them to quit. I mean, what do you make? What should we make from that incident in your assessment of it?
Well, I think his calculation on that, and I don't think he's entirely wrong, is that people in the media would care about the compliance issue, but people in the country would just care about the check. And I think in that sense, I mean, even if the Conservatives didn't win the 2015 election, I think he was probably right about this, that he didn't think ordinary Canadians were too concerned by the process stories that tend to fill your show, my show, column inches in newspapers and so on. But I think it's the point to take away from this, whether someone likes or dislikes him, is that he's always thinking of the intersection of policy and politics. He's not just thinking of, is this good for the country, but can this be communicated to voters, and the interplay between these things. And that was an example of where, yeah, he and the Conservatives believed that this was good policy. It was there for parents, but they wanted to make sure parents knew about it and knew that it was the Conservative government that was delivering those things to them.
Even his critics, though, Andrew, I think would say that they respect his political skills, right, to recognize these things, as you've pointed out. But they also say that he goes too far, distorts the facts, and just tramples on norms and rules. And this would be an example where, I mean, this was an election finance violation that he committed with this, right? So, like, how does that fit into the I guess the other side of it, recognizing the ability, but the kind of the disregard for the constraints that other people say they're bound by?
I think, I mean, a lot of the problem is that the institutions in Canada, generally speaking, are liberal institutions, are institutions that trend left. And I think that Conservatives have in the past tried to be more deferential to these institutions, and it hasn't worked out as well for them. So he's coming in here, and one of the reasons he's resonating with people is because he's unafraid to take aim at these things. I mean, whether people agree or not. I mean, when was the last time a Conservative leader looked at the Bank of Canada and said what Pierre Poilievre says about the Bank of Canada, about CBC, about other institutions like that? So I think that the point here in why Poilievre has been so effective, just looking at the poll numbers and also his success as leader, is that he doesn't view these things as sacred cows in the way that others have.
I want to ask you about the social conservative issue that you sort of mentioned right off the top, how in the past he voted against gay marriage, despite his personal story being that his adopted father is gay and they have a good relationship. Now, this was 20 years ago. He's evolved over time. He had a vote on reassessing the criminal code that dealt with areas linked with abortion, but nothing really since then in the last 10 to 15 years. Voted against a private member's resolution from Kathy Wagenthal a year or so ago, if I remember correctly. And unlike even Aaron O'Toole and certainly Andrew Scheer, he doesn't appear to have made any big promises to the SOCOM wing of the party in the leadership race. Yet this is where the Liberals are attacking him. How do you see Pierre Poilievre in the social conservative spectrum? Is it something he's agnostic on, that he is not socially conservative on, or he just doesn't, or he believes those things but keeps it hidden? Where do you place him in that spectrum?
I think he thinks social conservatives are a part of the conservative movement and a part of the Conservative Party, and that they have a place there. But as you mentioned, he is the first leader in the last three leadership races who has not really been elected because of that wing of the party. I also think during COVID, the calculation changed a little bit. For social conservatives, the imminent threat was, hey, can I open my church? Can I do this? Can I have religious freedom? It wasn't about abortion, and it certainly wasn't about gay marriage as much. So I think Pierre Poilievre did well with social conservative voters, not because he was talking about abortion, not because he was taking a position on that, but because the discussion itself had changed. So obviously there's going to be a balancing act in any caucus. How do you balance the interests of the Quebec caucus with the Alberta caucus, the pro-life caucus with others? But it sounds like, and again, obviously he's not in government, so it could change them, but it sounds like the caucus has been pretty united. They have been a pretty cohesive force, at least up until this point.
He has flat out said he's not going to change any laws when it comes to abortion. Mm-hmm. Yet this has been a vulnerability for the Conservatives in the last number of elections. How do you think he's equipped to handle it compared to, say, how Andrew Scheer did in 2019, where it went bad for him in the French language debate right away?
Well, I think the key is that the Conservatives need to have a position on it that's clearly communicated. I think you're right. And the fact that you're bringing this up right now is, I think, evidence of the point that the media will continue to talk about this. The media is going to bring up all of these questions about it. But if he can avoid changing his position on this or being unclear about his position, which happened in 2019 and 2021, he's going to suffer for it. But all indications to this point have shown that he isn't really dealing with that. He's not dealing with that internal conflict. He's been pretty clear about it, and that's that. Now, that's not going to stop the issue from being raised. The Liberals are trying. I'm not seeing it gain the traction that it has when they've done it in the past, though.
Well, I just want to say, I'm not raising it because I'm the media, and it's how you end your book, right? How he is going to deal with these social conservative challenges.
No, I'm not taking aim at you for doing that. I'm just saying that it's an issue that is the perennial question about conservative politics, which is, how is the Conservative Party going to deal with the abortion question?
Right. So how do you think, just as a final point, Andrew, if he wins, if the polls are right, and if the election is held and Pierre Poilievre wins the type of majority that is being projected, how do you think he will approach governing? He was aggressive when he was a minister, on his legislation. He tried to be ambitious and aggressive with it, with things like the Fair Elections Act, but there was pushback and he had to retreat. But he wasn't the prime minister at the time. He's made some big things, like on the CBC and others that you have mentioned as a core of his agenda. How aggressive do you think he will be should he win? Because my sense is that the first 100 days are going to be pretty dramatic if he becomes prime minister.
I would agree. I mean, one friend of his that I quote in the book, Adam Daifala, predicts a Mike Harris first term for Ontarians. That's obviously more familiar a reference than it is for others. But generally speaking, what I was informed of by people around Pierre Poilievre is that he definitely thought that the Conservatives under Stephen Harper moved a little too incrementally compared to where we are now. And that's, I think, where he is going to come out with a bolder agenda, I've been told. And again, this is all people trying to read him and get a sense of him. It's not coming directly from Pierre Poilievre for my purposes, but I think that that's definitely going to be on offer. And you're right. I think it's going to be a very eventful, to say the least, first 100 days in a Poilievre government if he does form government.
Andrew Lawton, the author of Pierre Poilievre, A Political Life. Thanks for your time today, sir.
Thank you, David.